Okay, so you've probably heard about, all this talk about big changes maybe coming to the Department of Education.
Yeah.
It's certainly something we've been keeping an eye on, and we've been looking at a pretty in-depth analysis of former President Trump's proposals,
Right?
especially this idea he's put forward for an American Academy. And
Yeah.
what we found when we looked into it,
hmm
you might find pretty surprising.
Well, yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think instead of just, kind of repeating the headlines,
Yeah.
we wanted to take you a little bit deeper into this.
Yeah.
Really try to unpack, the core arguments of this analysis,
Right.
kind of layer by layer, so that you can really understand what the implications might be of
Yeah.
this whole American Academy concept.
I think that's important because, when you first hear about maybe getting rid of a huge federal department like education,
Right.
your gut reaction might be one thing, but what we found when we really dug into it is that this proposal could be going in a totally different direction than you might think at first.
Yeah.
So let's dive right in.
Yeah.
The article that we've been looking at starts off with a really interesting point about this whole idea of ending the Department of Education.
Right.
Why is it that might not be as straightforward as it sounds?
Well, what I think is so interesting to think about right from the start is, the basic structure of government.
Yeah.
As the analysis really points out, a president can't just snap their fingers and eliminate a federal department.
Right.
That's a really fundamental change that requires Congress to act.
Exactly.
It's about, legislative power, not just a single decision.
So if a president can't actually do this on their own,
Right.
what's the strategy then behind saying something like that? What's the point?
Well, the piece that we were looking at suggests that it really could be a very calculated kind of political move.
Yeah.
If you think about it, just saying that you're going to end a major department like that,
Yeah,
that grabs attention.
it sure does.
It signals a really clear stance to, voters who maybe feel a certain way about the Department of Education.
Right,
Even if the immediate ability to actually do it might not be there.
right,
It's about, creating this image of decisive action.
right. It's more about the headline maybe than the immediate reality. Okay,
Right.
so now here's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
This is where it takes a turn that you might not expect. The analysis actually argues that instead of seeing less federal involvement in education,
Right.
this proposal could actually lead to more.
Yeah.
How does that apparent contradiction actually work out?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting,
Okay.
because while all the talk might be about, reducing the federal footprint,
Yeah.
Less government involvement,
Right.
the proposal actually lays out plans for a brand new federal institution,
Okay.
the American Academy.
Wait a minute. So the idea is to get rid of one federal entity
Right.
by creating another one.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of counterintuitive.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it is. It really is.
Yeah.
And, the article that we've been looking at, it really drives this point home.
Yeah. Okay.
Their main argument is that, instead of shrinking, the federal role in education,
Yeah.
this could actually be an expansion of federal control,
Right.
it's operating under a different name and a different structure.
So maybe a change in branding,
Right.
but not necessarily a decrease in the federal government's influence.
Exactly.
Okay, now how is this new American Academy supposed to be funded?
Yeah.
This seems like a really crucial part.
Yeah, it is.
And it could have some really big implications.
It really could.
So how is this supposed to work?
Well, the proposal is to fund the American Academy by taxing, fining, and even suing the endowments of large private universities.
Wow, taxing and suing university endowments.
Yeah,
That's a pretty aggressive approach.
it is.
And it would directly impact those institutions and even indirectly maybe impact you if you're
Yes.
connected to one of them in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the analysis frame this type of funding?
Well, the analysis doesn't mince words.
Okay.
It calls this a potentially authoritarian tactic where, the power of the government
Right.
is basically being used to take funds from private organizations.
Right.
The stated goal is to fund this new public service, that might benefit, some people, but the method they're using to get that money,
Yeah.
raises some serious questions about, the limits of government power, when it comes to private money.
The article uses some strong language and calls it outright theft.
Yeah.
And that really kind of underlines how controversial this proposed funding method is.
Mhm.
It's one thing to debate, how federal money is used,
Right.
But this is about getting money directly from private sources.
Exactly. And I think, if we connect that back to the bigger picture,
Right.
of how government interacts with private institutions, it really raises this key question.
Yeah.
Where do we as a society draw the line
Right.
when it comes to the government's ability to take private funds,
Yeah.
even if they're saying that it's for something good?
Right. For the public good or whatever.
Right,
So
exactly.
the American Academy is being presented as this free, top-tier education system.
Right.
And at first glance, that sounds like a great opportunity.
Yeah.
But the article brings up some educational resources that already exist.
Right.
And compares them to this, to this new idea.
Yeah, they do.
So can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, the analysis points to platforms like Khan Academy as examples of, so-called free education that's already out there
Okay.
that, you can already access.
Right.
But the big difference is that these existing options are usually funded by, private donations.
Okay.
And they operate totally independently.
Right.
And they're not controlled by the government at all.
So the current options are already more decentralized,
Right.
less subject to the government maybe stepping in and having an influence.
Exactly.
What are some of the downsides then
Right.
that the article brings up about a government-run platform like the American Academy?
Well, this is where, the worries about, potential political bias, censorship, and just overall, centralized control over what you're learning, they all come into play. If the government's running the whole thing,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a real risk that the curriculum,
Right.
the information that's being presented
Right.
could be influenced by the, political agendas of whoever's in power at the time.
So that's a huge thing to think about.
Yeah.
And, along those same lines, Trump actually said that the Academy would be, strictly non-political. Right. And specifically said it would be free of wokeness or jihadism.
Right.
But the article seemed to disagree with that
Yeah.
for reasons that are pretty important.
It is.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, what's really interesting, is this sort of contradiction. The analysis is saying that
Yeah.
by specifically saying that certain ideas will be excluded,
Yeah.
that actually automatically makes the platform political,
Right.
by defining, what's in and what's out.
Yeah.
The government is basically drawing political lines around education.
It's like saying something's non-political by specifically saying what it shouldn't include.
Exactly.
And the article even brings up Orwellian censorship.
Right.
And that really brings to mind some serious concerns about control over information.
Yeah. And, I think it highlights this worry about, state-controlled discourse.
Right.
If the government is the one deciding what's non-political
Right.
and what's not okay to learn, that raises some really big questions about, intellectual freedom and being able to, really engage with a wide range of different viewpoints.
Another big part of this proposal is that the American Academy would actually give out degrees
Right.
that would be recognized by the U.S. government and federal contractors.
Yes.
So what kind of impact could that have
Yeah.
on, students in the future?
Well, I think, if we think about the big picture of higher education, this could really change things,
Okay.
by offering these federally recognized credentials.
Right.
The American Academy would basically be directly competing
Right.
with existing colleges and universities,
Okay.
both public and private.
So it would really shake things up.
It would.
And the article actually suggests that this could put pressure on existing institutions to change, right?
Yeah.
How could that impact the diversity of educational choices that are out there?
Well, that's exactly the concern.
Okay.
The worry is that to, stay competitive and to make sure their graduates, are still eligible
Right.
for government jobs and contracts and things like that.
Yeah.
Traditional universities might feel like they have to align their programs
Okay.
and their standards with the American Academy,
Yeah. Right.
because it's the one that's federally recognized.
Right.
And this could end up leading to, less variety
Okay.
and less independent thought in higher education as a whole.
So less diversity in the choices you have for education.
Right.
Now, this is interesting. The article points out that there are some similarities
Yeah.
between this proposal and some ideas that come from, a very different part of the political spectrum.
Right.
So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the analysis makes this comparison to, Senator Bernie Sanders' idea of, free college for everyone.
Right.
While their intentions and how they're proposing to fund it are very different, the main point of the article applies to both.
Yeah.
They're saying that these approaches,
Right. Even though they come from totally different places,
yeah,
can both lead to more centralized control, you know?
right,
And they raise questions about where the money's coming from and how it's being used.
right.
In Trump's case, they call it coerced financial extraction,
Okay.
which is something to think about.
So it sounds like regardless of what the original goal is,
Right.
whether it's about, making education more accessible
Hmm.
or offering a different kind of choice,
Eh.
the underlying worry is about this possibility
Yeah,
of more centralized control and the ways they're trying to make that happen.
exactly.
Okay, so where does this leave us?
Right. The article has some broader implications, and I'd like to get your take on those.
Okay.
It really challenges people who might initially support these kinds of proposals.
Mhm.
And it asks them to think about whether this is really about reducing government intervention or if it's actually about strengthening federal power in a new way.
Right. And I think, that's something for everyone to consider,
Yeah.
because we've heard these big promises before,
Yeah.
that haven't really panned out.
Yeah.
So, the article is encouraging a critical look at what's been promised in the past
Yeah.
versus, what's actually happened.
Right.
And it suggests that often there's a pretty big gap between the political talk and the reality of how things actually get implemented.
So we should always be careful to look past the big statements
Absolutely.
and pay attention to the specifics of what's actually being proposed.
Absolutely.
Right.
And, to really drive this point home,
Okay.
the article uses this really vivid metaphor.
Okay.
The idea of, closing down the zoo,
Okay.
only to build an even bigger one right next door.
Okay, so what does that mean in this case?
Well, in this metaphor, the zoo represents the Department of Education as it is now.
Okay.
A big centralized federal system.
Okay.
And the promise is to close it,
Yeah.
which makes it sound like, we're moving towards less federal control.
Less centralized control.
Right.
Right.
But then they propose building this American Academy
Mm-hmm.
right next door,
Right.
which could end up being an even bigger and more centrally controlled federal thing.
Okay.
So it's suggesting that we might not actually see less centralized power,
Right.
just a change in, how it looks and how it's branded.
So maybe some changes to the organizational chart, but not really a shift away from federal control over education?
That's the idea.
Okay, so what's the main point that this article really wants to get across?
Well, the core message, the big takeaway
Mm-hmm.
is that it's so important to really examine political narratives,
Okay.
to look
It-
beyond, those nice sounding promises,
Right.
and really investigate, the specific details
Yeah.
and what could happen,
Right.
as a result of any proposed changes,
Yeah.
especially when we're talking about, big shifts in centralized control, whether it's in education
Yeah.
or any other area that affects your life.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into the analysis, we've learned that, this idea of ending the Department of Education might be a little bit misleading.
Right.
The real story might be about creating this new federal entity,
Right.
the American Academy,
Right.
which could actually give the federal government more control over education.
Mm-hmm.
We also talked about this controversial idea of funding it by taxing private university endowments.
Right.
We discussed the questions about this government-run free education platform compared to existing independent resources.
Mhm.
And, we looked at how even claims of being non-political can have political implications.
Right.
And this idea of a federal system for giving out degrees
Mm-hmm.
brings up important questions about competition
Right.
and the potential for everyone to become more uniform, in higher education.
Right.
In the end, this analysis is really pushing us to, really examine the details and think about whether these types of proposals actually reduce government involvement
Right.
or just change it in ways that we might not expect.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think this deep dive, it
Yeah.
really shows how important it is to look beyond the surface
Mm-hmm.
and analyze the underlying mechanisms,
Yeah.
when we're evaluating these political proposals.
So here's a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
If the goal is to make a better education system for everyone,
Right.
are there other ways to do that? Ways that actually prioritize, real decentralization
Right.
and give individuals more power to choose an education
Mm-hmm.
and support the growth of diverse educational models
Mm-hmm.
that aren't directly controlled by the government?
That's a really great question.
It's something to think about.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely.
It's a good question to ponder, for sure.
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It was great talking to you.
It was great being here.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, take care.
Bye.